Welcome, everyone, to The Deep Dive. We're hosted here on the Festoon channel, and this is part of our History Podcast section.
Great to be diving in.
Today, we're plunging into a civilization that, well, it didn't just survive, did it? It endured over 1,000 years, always seeing itself as the true heir to Rome. We're talking Byzantium, of course.
And specifically, their military. How do they manage that incredible longevity? That's what we're looking at.
Exactly. We've gone through the sources you provided, research, articles, notes, really trying to piece together how they built their forces, their unique tech and tactics.
How they defended those amazing strongholds.
Yeah.
And yeah, how they faced that final challenge.
Right. So our mission really is to pull out the key insights from all this material. We want to trace that evolution, see the strengths, and understand, well, the final moments of this incredibly long-lasting military machine.
Okay. Where do we start? It has to be Rome, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The Byzantines saw themselves as Romans, full stop. There wasn't like a clean break.
No, it was an evolution. Their military system grew directly out of the old Roman legionary structures.
You see that early on, things like the Presental armies, these were basically imperial field armies kept near the capital or wherever the emperor was.
But then, around the 7th century, things really start to change. Something quite innovative happens. The thematic system.
Ah, yes, the themes. This wasn't just moving units around, was it?
No, it was fundamental. A reorganization of empire and military together. It grew out of units like the Upsiki army over in Asia Minor.
That was the emperor's strategic reserve, right? Kept close to Constantinople.
Exactly. And the key insight here is how this system tied military service directly to land. Soldiers got land within these districts, these themes.
In return for hereditary military service. So you get this localized, kind of self-sufficient defense force.
Precisely. But, even that system wasn't static. It had to adapt.
Because that Upsikian army, the big important one, it started causing trouble, getting involved in politics.
Yeah, became unreliable.
Yeah.
Too powerful, maybe too close to the capital's intrigues. So Emperor Constantine V, after dealing with a major revolt involving them,
He did something pretty drastic.
he broke it up, just dismantled it. And then he started recruiting new professional troops, Palatine troops, specifically to guard Constantinople and him.
Independent of those potentially rebellious provincial armies.
Right, and that move was, well, crucial. It basically sets the stage for the core medieval Byzantine army, especially the Tagma.
The Tagma, these were the elite regiments, standing army based near the capital.
You got it. A central mobile strike force and the emperor's personal guard. Highly professional, very loyal.
And the evolution didn't stop there either. Later on, maybe 12th century onwards, another shift, the Pronoia system.
Yeah, the sources mention Pronoia. It seems like a move towards paying officials and soldiers more directly, using state revenues often tied to land grants, but maybe less directly linked to hereditary service than the original themes. A different model.
Okay, so that's organization. Let's shift gears. How did they actually fight? Their strategy.
Well, it was often quite different from, say, the Romans before them or many of their neighbors. They generally preferred limited warfare.
Not always looking for that one big knockout battle.
Not usually, no. The focus was often more on harassment, attrition, wearing the enemy down, maneuver.
Securing peace was the aim, even if it was temporary. And it's interesting how the sources frame even their offensive campaigns.
Often as defensive, right? Recovering lost territory.
And they were pragmatic, hugely adaptable. That really comes through in the material.
Oh, absolutely. If an enemy tactic worked, they weren't too proud to borrow it, whatever kept the empire safe.
So on the battlefield itself, what did that look like? Infantry.
Often a very dense infantry formation of phalanx, sometimes described as incredibly deep, maybe 16 ranks.
Wow. And they mixed troops within that, heavy and light.
Yeah, frequently. Sometimes heavy infantry in the middle ranks for stability. And behind them, archers. Essential missile support.
And protecting the front line from enemy arrows. They had a specific formation for that.
The Fulcon. Basically a really dense shield wall, like a tortoiseshell almost. Let them advance or hold position under missile fire.
Weapons, spears, swords.
Spears were primary for infantry. Cavalry used straight swords, the spatha. But later on, especially by the 10th century, you see the curved Paramirian saber becoming common.
And the heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, it must have been terrifying.
Oh, absolutely. Heavily armored horse and rider, usually deployed on the wings of the army.
Often with foot soldiers guarding their flanks, right? To stop them getting swarmed.
Exactly. And those adaptable tactics you mentioned.
Like the feigned retreat, that old steppe nomad trick.
Yeah. The sources show emperors like Alexios Akomnenos using that very effectively against the Normans. He wasn't afraid to learn from anyone.
And Alexios also used caltrops, didn't he? Those nasty spiked things scattered to cripple cavalry charges.
He did. Very practical, very effective in the right situation.
Now, you mentioned Alexios. Around his time, 11th century onwards, the army's composition starts to change quite a bit, doesn't it?
It does. There's a definite increasing reliance on professional mercenary troops.
And this really ramps up after some major defeats, like Manzikert in 1071.
Manzikert was huge, yes.
Yeah.
And Myriokephalon later, in 1176. These battles really damaged the traditional thematic armies.
So emperors like Romanos V, who fought at Manzikert, and later Alexios I, they had to look elsewhere for soldiers.
They did. They started recruiting heavily, both from within the empire, Greeks, Armenians, Iberians, but also from outside.
And who were these outsiders? A real mix, wasn't it?
An incredible mix. The sources mention Pechenegs, Ouz, Normans, Alexios I facing enemies on all sides. Specifically brought in Normans, Ruses, even Anglo-Saxons fleeing the Norman conquest of England.
Anglo-Saxons in Byzantium. That's amazing. And speaking of famous foreign troops, we have to talk about the Varangians.
Ah, the Varangian Guard, yes. Probably the most famous mercenary unit to serve the empire.
The emperor's personal bodyguards. Elite.
Absolutely elite, known for their loyalty specifically to the emperor's person, not necessarily Byzantine politics and those fearsome axes they carried.
But it's important, as the sources show, they weren't the only foreign unit, right? Lots of different mercenary groups served over the centuries.
Definitely. The Varangians are the most iconic, but they were part of that broader trend of using professional, often foreign, soldiers.
Okay, let's move off dry land. The Byzantine Navy. Crucial, surely.
Hugely crucial. Defending that massive coastline, controlling the sea lanes, the Bosphorus, the Aegean, projecting power. You couldn't hold the empire without a strong navy.
And when you talk Byzantine Navy, you inevitably talk about
Greek fire. Has to be. Probably the single most famous Byzantine military invention.
described in the sources just as liquid fire. Simple, but terrifying.
And here's the really fascinating part. The enduring mystery. We still don't know exactly what it was made of.
The recipe, lost completely. A state secret guarded so fiercely it never ever leaked.
Incredible, isn't it? The chronicler Theophanes says it was invented by a Syrian refugee named Kalenikos.
And it wasn't just fire, it had that unique, horrifying property.
It burned on water, which you can imagine in naval combat.
Devastating. Absolutely devastating. The sources point to key moments where it saved the day. Like that big Arab siege of Constantinople in 674.
Destroyed their fleet, yep, and used against the Rebses in the Bosphorus in 1043. It gave them a massive edge.
And how did they deploy it? It wasn't just throwing pots, was it?
No, the system was revolutionary for its time. Basically, the world's first flamethrower.
Really? How'd it work?
Bronze or copper cylinders on the ships held the preheated liquid. Then a pump, like a siphon or force pump, pushed it out through a nozzle, often one that could swivel.
Projecting this stream of fire and smoke.
Yeah, maybe up to 15 meters, aimed right at enemy ships, especially those low-slung galleys. Imagine a wall of fire that sticks to your ship and burns even on the water. Terrifying.
And the secret stayed secret. That technological edge lasted for centuries.
It really did. A huge factor in their naval dominance for a long time.
But even with Greek fire and adaptability, the empire eventually faced challenges it couldn't overcome. Those final centuries, things get tough.
Extremely tough. The sack of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade in 1204. That was a body blow.
The sources really show that as the point where Byzantium stops being a major power on the world stage, even after they retook the city.
Yeah, the restored empire was fragmented, always struggling. Pressure from the Seljuks in Anatolia hadn't gone away. Defeats like Myriokephalon had weakened them there long before 1204.
And then from the 14th century, a new power rises, the Ottomans.
Relentless pressure. They push into the Balkans, surround Constantinople, isolate it bit by bit.
Siege warfare was always part of Byzantine history, of course, right from the start.
Absolutely. They knew all the old tricks, incendiaries, ballistae, undermining walls. But something new was coming.
Gunpowder. Which brings us to 1453, the final siege.
The scene is just stark. Sultan Mehmed II arrives with this enormous army. Sources estimate maybe 80,000 men.
And the defenders, inside those huge walls?
Vastly outnumbered. Maybe 7,000 fighting men in total, Greeks, Genoese, volunteers.
And this siege, it wasn't just another siege, this was different.
Because of the cannons, the Ottoman gunpowder artillery, it was transformative. Those massive walls, the Theodosian walls, had held off attackers for over 1,000 years. They were legendary.
What they couldn't stand up to sustained heavy cannon fire. That was the key difference.
It really was. The cannons battered sections of the wall, especially around the Gate of St. Romanus. That's where the final assault focused.
May 29, 1453, before dawn.
The sources describe waves of attackers, scaling ladders against the battered walls, early types of hand grenades being used, torches, brutal fighting in the breaches.
But even outnumbered, facing this new tech, they fought back hard.
Heroically. The sources mention specific figures like Alexander Ypsilanti, Mustafa Pasha, leading the defense on the walls. Fierce resistance.
And the last emperor, Constantine I Palaiologos.
His fate is incredibly poignant. He refused to flee the city. He reportedly shed his imperial insignia and plunged into the thickest fighting when the walls were breached.
Died alongside his soldiers, his body never definitively identified.
A tragic but fitting end in a way. And we shouldn't forget the naval aspect either. The Ottomans finally blockading the Golden Horn by dragging ships overland. That sealed the city's fate too.
The fall of Constantinople. The end of the Roman Empire, truly. After more than, 2,000 years if you count from Rome's founding? Just incredible.
Looking back, it's the resilience that stands out, isn't it? The sheer adaptability of their military across a millennium.
From those Roman roots, through the thematic system, the elite tagma.
Their clever strategies of limited war and attrition, incredible innovations like Greek fire, that carefully guarded secret.
The use of diverse mercenaries, the Varangian Guard. They constantly found ways to survive, to punch above their weight.
For centuries, against foe after foe, their final stand in 1453 against overwhelming numbers and game-changing technology, it was heroic, even in defeat. The age of mighty walls was ending.
So here's maybe a final thought for you listening, something to mull over.
How did this military system, this empire, which was so incredibly good at surviving, at adapting for literally centuries, how did it finally fall?
What does its long history, its innovation, its eventual collapse tell us about warfare, about empires, about how times and technology change everything?
A lot to think about there.
It certainly is. Well, this has been our deep dive into the Byzantine military, hosted right here on the Hessian channel in our History Podcast section. Thanks for joining us.